I'd like to welcome you to the last session on assessing the Nyerere legacy today. But before we start, we're just going to have a brief statement from Wally Kane, representing Pambazuka.
Thank you. It's just a quick announcement. I am associated with Pambazuka News, Pambazuka Press, and Fahamu Networks for Social Justice. And we're selling the books at the back of the room. And I just asked Blair for a minute to let you know a bit more about Pambazuka, because we're at a kind of turning point in our development that I think will be interesting to all of you, especially in the context of a discussion of Pan-Africanism. Pambazuka was started by Bruce Manji in Kenya 10 years ago and has really grown into being a platform for social justice in the spirit and tradition of Pan-Africanism. There are over 2,500 writers who write for Pambazuka every week. It comes out in English and in French every week, and in Portuguese every 2 weeks. There are about 30,000 subscribers now to Pambazuka, and then 1 million people who read it off the website, who go to it every year. So it's quite a useful way to reach people in the continent and also in the diaspora. There are a lot of people and scholars outside of Africa who are interested in getting analysis and perspectives from social movements and from scholars who are interested in speaking to social movements. The new development that is coming in the next month or so is the website will move to a new platform that will allow much more interaction among the people who are reading Pambazuka. So the Pambazuka News will still be available free of cost, but to subscribers who become members, there'll be options for attending webinars like this, and I can report that this works really well. So we'll be doing that within Pambazuka on selected issues that members are interested in. There'll be opportunities for people to have blogs, to put up your own articles and things to stimulate debate. And I think one of the main principles that we have, besides creating dialogue among movements and supporting, is also the generation of new ideas and intergenerational discussion. So we try and really encourage young leaders in social movements and intellectuals to be in conversation with some of the people who have come before and are still around to talk to them. So I would just encourage you to look at the website. I'll be at the back if you want to take my card, which has more information. I actually live in Ottawa, but I'm helping Pambazuka reach out throughout the Americas, starting this week in Ottawa. So I'd be very also happy to hear any suggestions of other people you think we could talk to. Once we get to the new platform, we actually want people to sign on as individual members, but also as institutional members, and that's a way that institutions can support Pambazuka's development. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. Our two speakers on this last panel lived and worked in Tanzania during the Nyerere years. John Saul, to my immediate right, from 1965 to 72, and Fred Bienefeld, from 1969 to 74. Parenthetically, my first trip to Tanzania was also in the 70s and 74 when I was doing PhD research and went out to Hanang province to look at the famous Canadian aided wheat farms and also to do research on the infamous bakery. John Saul, now Professor Emeritus of Social and Political Science at York University, was Senior Lecturer in Political Science at the University of Dar es Salaam, as he said, for 7 years. His stint on the Hill, as it was known, was meant to be cut short after 2 years when the Canadian government refused to renew his contract. He was there on an external aid contract. It seems his struggles over the nature of the university were considered too radical. For a time, the university disagreed and hired him immediately on a local contract for another 5 years, albeit on a salary reduced by 70%. Ultimately, though, for the people making the decisions, John's commitment to progressive change in the university structure and curriculum, along with many colleagues in Tanzania and from abroad, made him too hot to handle, and his controversial career in Tanzania ended. John moved on from Tanzania, however, to teach in Canada, Mozambique, and South Africa. Almost a decade of his life in Africa and many trips back, including 2 to Zimbabwe and South Africa just in the last few months. Since his Tanzania days, he has managed a long career as a liberation support anti-apartheid activist on Southern Africa without endangering his job. Indeed, he was honored in 2004 as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. His formidable publication list consists of almost 20 books, some on Tanzania, as well as numerous articles and books on Mozambique, South Africa, and on development theories. These include, most famously, The State and Revolution in Eastern Africa and a 2-volume work on socialism in Tanzania, which relate to the conference today. However, he's had another publication come out just in the last couple of months in January, Liberation Light, and which collects some of his most recent essays. The questions he explores are broad-ranging and critical, looking at the significance of Nyerere's approach to African socialism and its application in Tanzania. For those now in the struggle in North Africa, a consideration of many of the issues he raises here will be central to their future. John.
Well, thank you very much. I should just, if I may, bid for Molly for equal time. There is in Toronto a service called Africa Files, which I hope some of you are aware of, but it is also, I am very much in support of Pambazuka, of course, but Africa Files is a Canadian variant that does very good work itself, including a online magazine, monthly publication, and every day a seemingly endless flow of news from Africa. So and there are many African affiliates. It's not just a Toronto-based thing. It's linked to a whole range of network of contacts in Africa, as is Pambazuka, of course.
They link to each other.
But these are very important sources that are at our service. I'm glad to have had Molly speak, but I think you should also keep your eye open for Africa Files, and I'm sure Blair will have the details on the email and so on. So I'm glad Linda said this, because I was beginning to feel that this was becoming a bit of a love-in between Tanzania and Canada. And my experience with Canada vis-a-vis Tanzania, particularly in the Arusha Declaration days, was, as Linda suggested, not nearly so sweet. And it was on Trudeau's watch as well, if I may say, that I was sacked from my role as a Canadian external aid. And they didn't like the Arusha Declaration. They didn't like what was happening in Tanzania. Now, of course, since Tanzania has moved towards a much more market-friendly general approach, Canada is much more friendly towards Tanzania, although that's within a framework of a general cutback of Canadian aid to Africa. But at least Tanzania has now moved up the table as a somewhat more acceptable partner for what little CETA and other aid there is for Africa. So I just want to avoid this becoming, as I say, a love-in between Tanzania and Canada. And I guess my paper as well is to preempt the danger, that was why I wrote it this way, to preempt the danger of this becoming a love-in for Nyerere or for Ujamaa, because I think there are questions to be raised. I've already raised a few of them from the floor, and I would want to continue to do that. I'll read you the first paragraph or two of my paper. It's a long paper, and people are welcome to have it, and it can be circulated if people are interested. But for those who, again, got in touch with Blair, if he has any waking minutes to attend to these things. But I'll just start it off. It says, the moment of Tanzanian socialism, Ujamaa, was, when situated within the long arc of African history, or even African post-colonial history, brief. In the late 60s and early 70s, Tanzania was certainly an exciting place to be. But the implications of what had begun with the Arusha Declaration in 1968 were too dangerous and irreverent for even its initial champion, Julius Nyerere. Surely, on the one hand, Horace Campbell is correct, and this is in this book, Africa's Liberation, the Legacy of Nyerere, which is available at the back, I gathered. Campbell is correct to eulogize Nyerere himself as, quote, a great human being who demonstrated his respect for the ordinary African and for the lives of all human beings, close quote, and Campbell then proceeds to compile a convincing list of Nyerere's many achievements, about which we've heard a lot today, and I thought this presentation by our friend was particularly good. Yet the continent will learn too little if by not also registering the man and the Ujamaa Project's weaknesses. For from these two we can all learn. As Feroza Manji explicitly notes in her preface to this very same book, that while we, quote, should not be shy in celebrating his achievements, at the same time he would be among the first to condemn any attempts to romanticize his period in office, close quote. It is in the spirit of Mamji's observations that I offer the presentation or paper. Thus, on the one hand, Nyerere spoke of empowering the people, and with Mongozo, the Tanu guidance of 1971, seemed to have persuaded his fellow Tanu leaders actually to embrace the notion of genuine control by the people from below. And yet, when the same people actually began to move, the workers at the Mount Carmel rubber factory, the peasants in Rovuma, students at the university, Nyerere joined with the state and its bureaucrats, political and administrative, to slash back, to crush the workers, to smash the Rovuma Development Association, and then forward Ujima Vijijini only from on high and by means of a self-defeating policy of enforced villagization, and to have student president Akivaga whisked away from the campus and summarily dispatched back home to Kenya on a waiting plane. His crime apparently being to invoke Mongozo in criticism of the university's hierarchy. Tanzania, an exciting place momentarily to be, but ultimately in many ways also a sad and defeated one. And so when I get carried away with the spirit of Tanzania-philia, as it was once called, I check back on my own memory bank of things that happened the time I was there. The Akivaga case sticks particularly in my mind. As you will remember, at the university, those of you who were there, it may still be the case, there was a place to drink coffee just below the steps to the administration building on the open square there. You would sit out and have your coffee. And I can vividly remember to this day a series of army vehicles pulling up onto the campus just outside the president's office, which is in that building. And Akivaga had been invited. He was the head of the student organization, the one who was invoking Mongozo, as I said. These military vehicles pulled up on the campus in front of the president's office, and we were sitting there watching this as we drank our tea. And what we see next is Akivaga being dragged, and I mean dragged, out of the administrative building by a number of soldiers with great big guns and other things, bump, bump, bump down the cement stairs, and thrown like a sack of potatoes into the back of this military vehicle and sped away to the airport. Now this is a sobering moment. It happened on Nyerere's watch. I won't say Nyerere ordered precisely that thing, but that was the way dissent was being dealt with, even under Mongozo. That was Akivaga paying the price for the temerity to speak up, and only speak. Let me make it clear. He wasn't throwing bombs at the administration office or anything like that. He was speaking up for some greater voice for students, and it wasn't allowed. It's as simple as that. Not only that, Arnold Temu, who was a good friend of mine, was the dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Dar es Salaam, stood on the side of the student body as he saw it, and against this high-handed use of administrative power vis-a-vis the students. He paid a heavy price for that. Arnold Temu was fired as a member of parliament. He was one of the 10 wise men, or whatever it was, who were auxiliary members of parliament. He was sacked. In a few years, he was forced out of the university. He went on an itinerary around Africa, to Nigeria first, then he was in, I think, Swaziland or Lesotho. He wound up at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. I was in Dar about 6 or 8 years ago, and I was sitting in the bar at the New Africa Hotel, and I looked at next to me, and here sitting next to me was somebody who looked, despite his gray hair, which we all had, like Arnold Temu. I said, "Arnold," I said, "what are you doing back here? I thought you were in South Africa." He said to me, "Now this is very interesting, and it's something we have to think about. It's not something I would say. I don't agree with it entirely." But I said to him, "What are you doing back here?" He said, "Well, I've been, as you know, in various places, but I said, I've come back to take a job at the new Open University here in Dar es Salaam." He said, "I had pledged that I would not return to work in Tanzania as long as Nyerere was alive." Now that's a pretty strong statement. It's a sobering statement. It's not a usual statement, but it is. Arnold Temu was not a dumb man, and he felt this very strongly. So I think we have to kind of shade our picture to some degree with reference to that kind of fact, as I see it. My memories are very firm in these cases. They're also firm about some other things that I think also have to be taken into account when we try and add up the record on Nyerere. Now, a lot has been said about Nyerere's role in Southern Africa. And of course, it was exemplary. This is hard to do this, because on one hand you're saying he was so strong in so many ways. And if we look at Canada, there's never been a prime minister, and I mean never, in Canadian history as strong as Nyerere. It's as simple as that. There aren't many examples in Africa who are as strong as Nyerere. But he had some weaknesses too, and high-handedness and authoritarianism, to some degree, was one of them. Now in Southern Africa, for example, he was very committed, as we all know, to the liberation of Southern Africa. We saw that in the film, we all know that. But there's also some chinks in that armor, and this is the way that they worked. In terms of Mozambique, for example, there was a struggle after the death of Mondlane, when he was killed, as to who would succeed. Nyerere, against the pull of some of the more black nationalist ministers, like C. Jonah and others in the cabinet, Maswanya, Mananka, Boki Mananka, these people were pulling for support Simango. Nyerere said, no, we're going to support Michel. And so he stood for the good guys, if you like, in that crisis. Huh? Mondlane had just been killed. So who's going to succeed Mondlane? Now, on the one hand, there's Simango, who was very close to the Portuguese himself, and on the other hand, Michel, who carried on the struggle and eventually freed Mozambique. That's a good thing. But another case in point is also worth looking at. This is in Namibia. In Namibia, you may recall that in the 1970s there was quite a bit of turmoil in SWAPO. And this turmoil was taking place where SWAPO existed on the ground in Zambia. And a number of student leaders who had come out of Namibia were making trouble for Sam Nujoma and his team in Zambia. They wanted to call a Congress, which is already 2 or 3 years overdue. Well, Nujoma didn't operate in politics that way. He was no Democrat either. So what happened? The Zambian army, at Nuyoma's request, attacked the camps of SWAPO, rounded up a whole series of people. They put behind bars for some weeks thousands of SWAPO militants, but 13 of them they arrested as being particular troublemakers. And these are young, very committed people who were asking only for a Congress. Now, I've studied this quite carefully, so I know they were only asking for a Congress. Again, they weren't throwing bombs or doing anything. They were taken to jail in Zambia. Now, the problem with Zambia as a place to jail these people was that it had habeas corpus. There was every reason to think that these people were going to be released on habeas corpus by the judges within a matter of days. They could not be held indefinitely in a Zambian prison. Now, here's the hard part for us to swallow, but it is true. One night, under cover of darkness, these people were taken from the prison, put on a plane, and flown to Dar es Salaam. In Dar es Salaam, they were thrown in prison. No questions asked, no habeas corpus, they're gone. They survived, most of them, and lived to tell a tale, but some years later, and mostly in exile for a long, long time. So this was, again, Nyerere massaging the outcomes in southern Africa. For Nujoma, a kind of club of presidents took place that locked Nujoma into place. So I think, these are facts. There are other good facts, better facts, more pleasing facts, and we've heard a lot of those, and I think it's important that they be heard too, because I'm still, I write about this all the time, I'm wrestling all the time. How do we add this up, Nyerere's certainly better than Trudeau or Mulroney ever could have hoped to be, but what do we make of these other dimensions? Because at the same time as Nyerere was doing some of these things, he was also, of course, standing up for the principles that we've talked about. And one of the things that stands out in my mind, because Fanon was a big name in our day, the wretched of the earth, and we looked at him as a very clear observer of what was happening in most African countries in the wake of independence. And there was a meeting that Nyerere spoke to in Dar es Salaam about that time, in which this was the newspaper report, which is pretty much a verbatim account. Now this to me is Fanonism in action. And that Nyerere's saying it too. The same Nyerere that I've made several criticisms of, he says this: Nyerere called on the people of Tanzania to have great confidence in themselves and to safeguard the nation's hard-won freedom. Mwalimu warned that the people should not allow their freedom to be pawned, as most of their leaders were purchasable. He warned further that in running the affairs of the nation, the people should not look on their leaders as saints or prophets. The president stated that the attainment of freedom in many cases resulted merely in the change of colors, white faces to black faces, without any exploitation and injustices, and above all, without the betterment of the life of the masses. He said that while struggling for freedom, the objective was clear, but it was another thing to remove your own people from the position of exploiters. Now that's a very powerful statement by Nyerere. And so I think that's important. That's on the other side of the balance, if you like. Now, how much Nyerere could or couldn't have achieved in Tanzania with all the limits that the country had and the economic and social backwardness of it as a result of British colonialism and the like, raises some serious questions. But and I think it's also clear that Nyerere raised a range of critical questions. He continued to raise critical questions after his retirement, as your film showed so eloquently. He spoke about the IMF and the whole global context within which Tanzania had to struggle to find a way forward. But that, on the one side, against these other negatives. And that's why I regretted the absence of Leander Schneider, who has written a very powerful thesis which together is becoming a book, which says quite clearly, now this is his history, Tanzanian history shows that above all, that turning a blind eye to the tensions of participatory development will neither make them go away or allow one to avoid the serious costs implied by swiftly reducing participation to near meaninglessness. He says, not only did the policy of Ujamaa villagization fail to improve the material conditions of Tanzania's rural population, but the adoption of coercive means to further it also points to the authoritarian side of Nyerere's rule. And the treatment of the Ruvuma Development Association, as I said earlier, is a key case in point, where whether Nyerere was upset about it, whether it was forced upon him by TANU, we're talking about Nyerere plus TANU. They snuffed out, smashed, I said, and I was told that it was a good word to use, smashed socialism from below. Genuine socialism by real rural socialists. There's no question of that. So we have to weigh that into the balance. I said this about Nyerere. Now, this may be a bit too tough. And Nyerere did, however, take a vanguard party model, very much like the one exemplified by the Soviets. Now, there was some one-party democracy. There's a debate about how democratic that was. But I came to the conclusion, in short, Mwalimu as teacher too often became, at best, benign autocrat of the classroom, and at worst, stern and officious headmaster. At great long run, cost, one fears, to the emergence of a strong and self-confident citizenry. Indeed, if one has not learned to be sufficiently suspicious of the vanguard party model from the experience of socialism in Eastern Europe, Tanzania, and Mozambique, it would have been useful to have, Tanzania would serve as a useful refresher course as to the real price to be paid for choosing uncritically such a vanguardist option. Now, those are hard words, but they're not unconsidered, and I invite you to at least think about them. Schneider is a very strong spokesman of these positions, and it does remind me also of a debate I had with Cranford Pratt at the University of Toronto, which he defended, I felt very uncritically, the one-party state as a democratic model for Africa. And he accused me, I mean, this is minor beer compared to the long run of history, but he accused me of being a vanguardist. My vanguardism involved in enforcing the role of the workers and peasants, and if you like, students, to actually take ownership of their own socialism, rather than to have it filtered through vanguard party model that Nyerere, with some minor adjustments, and they were minor, although not absolutely unimportant, had in mind. So I think we have to look at some of these things a little bit more critically. I think as well, the fact that Nyerere, in a sense, shifted the attention away from an active peasantry, which was what the Latoa Ruvuma model involved, towards one that was state-imposed, against his statement in that film. Because what he did subsequently to whenever that was taken was to enforce villagization. I think as well there were some other prices about that came from the tilt of within the tilt of South Africa's of Tanzania's macroeconomic strategies too. you could imagine an economic policy that was not about just bringing in external aid or external investment, more to the point, external investment, and hoping that that would spin off advantages for the population. By and large, that was the extent of their economic strategy. They did nationalize a certain number of industries. What they didn't launch was an industrial strategy that related to servicing the needs of the people in the country, so that people growing things in the country would service the needs of the industrial sector. That kind of link between rural and industrial transformation was never quite made, and several people at the time were making this point. Clive Thomas, who was from Guyana, a very skilled economist, was arguing precisely for this kind of policy. The socialism, as he called it, the socialism of accumulation, of primitive accumulation. You start making these links, get the links going within the country. Nobody ever said, and Bill Luttrell is another one who said the same kind of thing. Nobody ever said you had to cut yourself off completely from the external world. The question is, where did the main motor of the economy lie? And Tanzania, for all its rhetoric about socialism, never quite found a way to think through an economic strategy that would make internal linkages the key to their transformation and economic growth. Now, these are controversial questions, but I think the fact is most of these things were never really discussed in the way that they should have been. So there was a whole lot of questions then that were being left out, and just to cite another Canadian case, Bourbonniere has written an incredibly good thesis, which I hope will become a book, out in California. She wrote it first in Dalhousie here in Canada, on the student crisis. And she says the following: the Akivaga crisis, which was seen as a failure to follow through on the promises of Mongoza at the university, was the first indication of a gap between Nyerere's political theory and practice. And another person who has some interesting things to say about this was Bibi Titi. As you may all remember, was one of the few but important women leaders of TANU in the early days. She has written an article, which is in Tanzanian Journal, where she talks about those early days and how she saw women being passed over. Now, this is another front of liberation. We heard that Nyerere was for gender liberation, but how important, how much did he actually do to empower women? BBTD says this: when power was transferred to the nationalist government, the story changed. The rhetoric changed. Women's experiences were no longer relevant to the post-colonial struggles against neocolonialism, imperialism, and the management of the state apparatus, it was said. In our discussion, BBTD ironically said, I started smelling fish when the first cabinet was named, with no women. Now I'll just read you my concluding paragraph then. Strengths and weaknesses then, but the question remains, should not Tanzania's socialist moment constitute a real learning experience for a continent that is still not fully confronted the threat of continuing subordination by global capital? A lot depends, of course, on what you wish to learn, but in a very real sense, one is tempted to say that nothing has been learned, or if something has indeed been learned, it has been entirely the wrong thing. Thus, in South Africa, to take one example, the latter is precisely the case. There, the cases of Tanzania and Mozambique have been viewed, particularly by that country's black elite, entirely one-sidedly and quite opportunistically, as having been, quite simply, case studies of misguided policies, case studies of precisely what not to do. Not to attempt to realize socialism and instead settle for the kind of recolonization by global capital that has occurred. Rather, the lesson taken should actually have been not to dare to challenge global capital, not to dare to challenge local hierarchies, not to dare to challenge the presumed logic of the marketplace, which produces the kind of inequalities that Fred has been talking about. No, I would suggest the lesson should be quite a different one. The very real costs of not having dared enough. Indeed, with respect to this issue posed in this way, the jury is surely still out. The deeper problems and challenges that existed in the 1960s and 1970s continue to confront Africa today. They had begun to be sketched by Nyerere and the early TANU leadership, as had been earlier by Nkrumah, for all the weaknesses of his own project, by Cabral and Fanon, and later by Michel. Here, warts and all, Nyerere, the Mwalimu, can still teach us. Whether other Africans, either in Tanzania or elsewhere, can or will so learn, and again take up ever more effectively the struggle and move to confront and to overcome their sobering post-colonial global capitalist legacy is an open question for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I'd like to introduce the second speaker, Fred Bienefeld, a professor in Carleton School of Public Policy and Administration. Fred worked in Tanzania from 1969 to 1974, mainly with the Economic Research Bureau for DevPlan. He also conducted a major urban survey with CEDA and with OECD support. At the time, he published a range of papers on manpower planning, trade unions and wages, industrial development, housing policy, and the construction industry. Subsequent to this period, he was involved in 2 ILO missions to Tanzania in 1978 and 1983, dealing with a wide range of employment-related issues. Since then, Fred's focus has become more international, though always with sub-Saharan Africa and Tanzania as one of the areas of special interests. He travels so extensively that a apocryphal story has it that his wife and son once asked him to sign the guest book.
Is that right?
Fred.
It's apocryphal. Thank you, Linda. And John is indeed a hard act to follow. John is an old friend, and I admire his work enormously. I have rewritten my notes twice in the course of the day. I want to talk about 3 things. I want to talk about Nyerere's ideas and their significance to me. I want to talk about the economic issues that I raised in the very first session, and which I think are more controversial than most people think. And then I want to just develop a brief, well, not really a response, but my thoughts on the issues that John has raised, very powerful as they are. I'll start with the ideas. And here I can be fairly brief because I am a great admirer of Nyerere's work. I still tell my students that reading Nyerere's collected books is one of the best introductions into the theory of development, because they are so thoughtful and so incisive and so holistic in their approach, and this is what sets them apart. Of course, I was rather desperately worried this morning when I discovered that our Prime Minister is also suggesting that his practice is somehow following in the footsteps of Nyerere. This either means that Nyerere really should be appointed a saint, or that you read history the way you want to read history. And that's, I guess, a salutary reminder. What was at the heart of Nyerere's ideas? And here I'm talking necessarily at a fairly general level. I think the primary focus on the need to create a polity that could be the basis for policy. This issue has come up in a very interesting way several times during the course of today's discussion. And to me, it's an issue that I keep returning back to. Can't seem to escape it. Whatever problem I start with, I end up with this question, because the whole notion of public policy and the whole notion of development and policy to promote development presumes the existence of a collectivity, a political collectivity that is capable of making choices in the collective interest, in the public interest. And those collectivities don't just exist, they need to be created. And I would put more strongly, they need to be preserved. And I'll come back, and you made some interesting comments in the first session. What I see in the world before me, and I've been writing about this for some considerable years now, I see a return to the conditions of the 1920s, not just in the developing world, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, everywhere in the world. I see a return to a situation where, as W. Yeats wrote, the center will not hold. And this is a disaster for all of us. When Nyerere comes to power, he confronts that problem and recognizes that that is a primary problem. It's interesting, if we had time, you could see that it's a layered problem. He understands that in order for anything resembling rational, desirable development to be possible in this country that history has bequeathed to him for a time, he understands that he has to create a sense of of common interest, a sufficient sense of solidarity to allow policy to be framed in that way. Now, of course, he also believed in Pan-Africanism, as people said. So then you say, well, of course, this is not an either-or question. You can have collectivities at this level, and then you can have a larger collectivity, to which those smaller collectivities, of which they become a part. Or you think of the larger collectivity as simply one nation-state, and then I would humbly submit that the problem of creating a meaningful political process at that level would be truly insurmountable. I think the European Union is discovering that. So his emphasis, his understanding that before you did anything else, there was not even a question about policy this, policy that. You had to create a polity that could be the basis for policy and for development. And that to me is absolutely key. The second thing that's key is his understanding that it was the human consequences of development that were absolutely critical. The third was that sovereignty was a sine qua non, and I've already quoted Keynes, and I think Keynes was actually very radical in many respects, and that quote of Keynes, unless the rate of interest is nationally determined, no society can pursue its own favorite social experiments. It goes to the heart of the matter. And that's what we're discovering today. I could have graphs here to show you what's happened in the United States, what's happened to the proportion of GDP earned by the top 1%. And it's an extraordinary graph. It has a peak over here in 1929. It drops precipitously. It runs along a trough for a quarter century. And then it goes up, and now it's surpassed the 1929 peak. Well, you tell me, was this a democratic decision? Do you think the American people voted for this? No. The American people are finding themselves in a situation where their country can't pursue the social experiments that its people actually would choose. And so I think Nyerere was absolutely right in understanding that that was the overriding requirement. And as he himself wrote and said, the fact that the African community and the European community and the Asian community lived at such different levels and in such different worlds in a sense, he was very eloquent about saying that those differentials had to close if that project of creating a polity could be conceivable. And I might remind you that fathers of the American Constitution, several of them repeatedly wrote that this experiment with Republican government that we are undertaking could never work unless certain conditions were met. And the two conditions they cited most frequently was income differentials must remain modest, and this one is a mouthful, those seeking office and those voting for them must have a high regard for public virtue. Meaning, they have to have a concern with the public interest, a genuine concern with the public interest. And so I would, if we start to discuss democracy and the one-party state, I would say that Nyerere's thinking on this matter I find plausible even today. Democracy is a word. Democracy is a word that describes a society that exists in a situation where citizens are prepared to settle their differences peacefully through the ballot box. It is clearly, in my view, a highly desirable, it is the most desirable form of government, without question. But it is not universally applicable. This situation is feasible once you have constructed a society, or it is feasible in a society that has certain characteristics. In other societies, if you airlift democracy into a society that has really deep income divisions, power divisions, regional and racial divisions, then democracy just becomes political competition that will increase the divisions. And that's not just true of Tanzania. Great Britain, the cradle of democracy. They suspended democracy in 1932. They formed a national government because they said the crisis has reached such levels that electoral processes now would become dangerously divisive, and therefore we have to form a national government. I'll call it a one-party state, if you like. We may face those choices. The United States may face those choices. Some would argue they already have a one-party state. It's just the party has two wings with different names. And then Nyerere understood, and this is, I'm still talking about what I consider key about his ideas. He understood that development in the end has to come from production and from your own resources. That development is not going to happen by invitation, that it is, and that was the sense in which I read him talking about self-reliance. The socialist part of his undertaking is key, but in my view, it is key as a relatively pragmatic expression of the idea that the market has to serve the social interest. This was not socialism without markets. This was socialism that existed in the presence of markets. And I believe, for my sins, based on my understanding at this point of theory and of history, that that is what we have to struggle for. That the idea that the state can take over all functions in society leads exactly to the kind of top-down bureaucracy which will never be truly participatory or truly capable of harnessing people's energies and enthusiasm. The great irony of places like Cuba and Eastern Europe is precisely that you have states that have been preaching their virtues incessantly, literally incessantly for decades, and the result amongst the people is the exact opposite of what they intend. They look at the state and they don't want to hear this one more time. So Nyerere, his ideas, to me, set out a set of priorities and an approach to the development process, which I thought at the time was exciting and serious and valuable. And after all these years, I'm even more convinced of that. And so now I want to address the second part of the debate, the part that has kind of got really very almost universally accepted. That, yes, well, Nyerere had all these good ideas, but he really just messed up the economic side of things. He didn't manage the production side, and so the thing, of course, collapsed of its own weight. Well, I think that's not a plausible or a defensible position, although it's very widely held. And I begin by reminding you that there were two breaking points in this story, 1973-74 and 1982 to 84. And 73-74, well, I could show you a graph of United States wages, real wages of United States full-time production workers. I could show you a graph, and you'd see that that graph, the real wages of American production workers, peaked in 1974 and have been steadily declining since. At a conference in Holland in 1978 with Amartya Sen and Francis Stewart, I gave a paper in which I said, look, if the logic that is now unfolding in the global market, if that logic remains in place, then I think that this will probably happen. Wages, never mind the developing countries thriving and prospering, the wages in the developed countries will stop rising. This was treated as an extreme ideological observation. Of course, those people aren't available for me to show them the graphs now. The world changed. And why did the world change? Well, the world changed, first of all, because of the oil crisis. And what did the oil crisis mean? It meant a dramatic, radical shift that confronted most developing countries, except for the oil exporters, with a situation that left them essentially in a situation where their economies were not viable, not even close to being viable. They had spent 10 years, 15 years, whatever the case was, building a certain kind of economic structure with the help and assistance of everyone. Of course, in those days, everybody was an import substituter. And here they were. That was a risky strategy. They had invested in the long term. And all of a sudden, like going over a cliff, that structure which they built was not viable. I stood in front of the Tanzanian cabinet in 1983 as a member of the ILO mission with Nyerere in the room, and I put up a graph which showed the amount of foreign exchange that was needed by Tanzania to keep the economy running at even a minimal level of efficiency, and the amount of foreign exchange that was available. And the gap was this big. It wasn't Nyerere that failed. It wasn't the policies that failed. Nobody. You could stick all the MIT economists in the world in that room. They couldn't find a solution to that. Tanzania was trapped in a structure that had been built over the previous 10, or if you were talking about the 1980s, 15 years, and you can't move out of that structure quickly. And then along came the neoliberal dreamers, and they said, oh yes, well, the solution to this is for Tanzania to liberalize its economy, because that's been the problem. That wasn't the problem. Do you know that the most successful developing countries, and there are very few of them, the only genuinely successful developing countries that grew rapidly, that transformed their economies, and that raised wages across the board consistently over this period, mainly the East Asian countries, they were heavily statist economies. And they were able to do this only because the state had a strategic vision, because the state mobilized resources, protected the country against volatile international capital flows, allowed resources to be channeled systematically into the creation of strong industrial technological foundations, which are the sine qua non for a high-wage society. That's the actual lesson of history. Not that import substitution is a disaster. Even Bhagwati, even the strongest exponents of export promotion, in moments of weakness or carelessness, acknowledged that the most successful export promotion countries actually built the foundations for their export promotion success during previous phases of import substitution. So what happened in Tanzania and in so many other countries is Tanzania got to that point, and then they were strangled. They were not assisted. And if they wanted assistance, they had to dismantle their economies. They had to abandon all those principles that Nyerere had been sticking to, and we've heard this very clearly today. And I'll just briefly note the contrast between this situation and what happened in the late 1940s in Europe. In 1947, Western Europe ran into a massive foreign exchange crisis. They were growing very rapidly, but they weren't generating enough exports. They were sucking in imports, and they met an enormous crisis. And briefly, thought was given to responding to that in the normal way, in the way that the IMF and others did in the 80s. And then even the strongest supporters of that ideology recognized, as one writer put it, such a response would have been, quotation marks, politically absurd, disastrous, because communism was very strong in most of the Western European countries, and these countries were sitting on the edge. And so the Marshall Plan was invented and poured resources into those countries, not additional loans, but grant resources, resources that allowed those countries to continue to grow and to continue to raise wages domestically and cover their external deficits using those funds. And that was a win-win situation, because that actually solved their problem and actually allowed them to grow and to improve conditions of their populations. That would have been the solution for the developing world and for Tanzania. But that solution wasn't on the table because, well, you just didn't have enough clout. And when the Berlin Wall came down, things got even worse. Well, I'm going to run out of time, so let me just very briefly say I've worked on these things for quite some time. Tanzania, until 1973-74, with all these bad policies, was actually making very significant progress on every front. Even in industry, and I did a very detailed study of industry, which is widely said to have been disastrous. It's simply not true. On almost every indicator, industry was making progress. It was slow progress, and a lot of it was local industry, by the way. And agriculture was making significant progress. The situation changes. I was in Dar es Salaam in 1978 with an ILO mission. The oil crisis had just been digested. Sugar prices had risen, so Tanzania's balance of payments suddenly looked not so bad. And we in the ILO mission were saying this oil crisis was just the beginning. It's a very dangerous international environment. Tanzania must be absolutely cautious about taking on debt because this is the way you get crushed in the end. And next to us, parallel to us, there was a World Bank group in Tanzania at the same time. And they were saying, oh, nonsense, the crisis is over. The way you deal with problems like this is you grow out of these problems. And they were offering money and suggesting that Tanzania should borrow and invest. And they were pushing, and ultimately successfully pushing, the Mufindi paper mill, which they subsequently pointed to as the great white elephant that allegedly showed how irrational Tanzanian policymakers were. The story that Tanzania's agriculture was being dramatically exploited by the new parastatals. There's a paper I wrote for the ILO. I go through the numbers with the greatest care. It was simply a myth. And it was a myth that started with just an oversight. What happened was the marketing boards, which had been created again with the support from outside, including the World Bank, the marketing boards took over a bunch of functions, inputs, extension services that used to be done by Kilimo. So, on paper, suddenly these marketing boards absorbed a much larger margin of the final product because they carried all these costs on their books now. But that little change wasn't noted. Just a series of papers emerged which pointed to this fact and developed this notion that Tanzanian agriculture was being desperately exploited by these corrupt statist enterprises, marketing boards. 1984 study by the World Bank looking at Tanzanian agriculture literally demonstrates that the arguments, the neoliberal arguments that were then put forward as solutions to Tanzania's problems could not be true, and that the World Bank itself didn't believe them. Because what those arguments implied was that if you freed rural marketing, if you liberalized the agricultural sector, then real farm gate prices would rise. That would lead to a strong supply response, and that in turn would deal with Tanzania's yawning foreign exchange gap. I haven't got time to go into details here. This was a complete myth. And in 1984, the World Bank itself does a major study of Tanzanian agriculture. And in this study, they acknowledge, and I quote, I paraphrase, Tanzania's agricultural circumstances are such that the massive, that a price increase, even if it were to happen, would have virtually no significant supply, would elicit no significant supply response, because the underlying infrastructural problems are so great that that would be impossible. Furthermore, they say, unfortunately, the circumstances of Tanzania's agriculture are such that the investments that would be needed to create that infrastructure would not be commercially viable under current circumstances. Well, if you read between the lines here, it says, well, under current circumstances, Tanzanian agriculture is a basket case. And then the most incredible conclusion is, they say, and that means that the solution of this problem would have to await the arrival of an entirely new technology that would raise productivity levels dramatically in order to make those infrastructural investments commercially viable. And as I point out in my paper, not only are we not talking about fairyland, but we also have to understand that in the new world, those new technologies are owned by people. And they are going to be made available by people who will ensure that they extract most of the additional productivity gains. So the story that Tanzania was a great economic failure is not tenable. I can talk about more examples, but let's leave it there for now. Which takes me to John's points, and they're powerful points. And I was there, and I was very emotional about some of the events that he talks about. But in the grand scheme of things, when I stand back and look at the picture as a whole, I have to say that I don't find it possible to persuade myself, and it may well be that John is right, but I don't think that simply letting those movements run would have solved this problem. I think that mobilization is important, absolutely important, and I think Nyerere tried to do that, and actually he did it rather successfully in many ways. Somebody earlier talked about Nyerere getting through to the people directly, and it remained true to the end that no matter how bad things got in the 80s, Nyerere could go to almost any place in the country, any factory, and he would be received very, very warmly, because he'd made a connection with the people. When one is trying to, if you imagine yourself in Nyerere's position and you're trying to manage a process, to direct a process which is that complex, and where there are so many contending factors and interests that have to be accommodated, there will be times when decisions are made. I'm told, this may be apocryphal, but I was told by somebody who said he'd been at that executive meeting where the RDA was disbanded. I was told that Nyerere was in tears at that meeting. So there are other forces at work here, and they have to be considered. They're part of this story. That's exactly the difficulty. The country wasn't ready-made with class forces with a clear idea of where they wanted to go. And so the fact that these very unfortunate events happened is serious, and my argument does expose me to the possibility that you begin to be seen as an apologist for any kind of authoritarianism. But for me, the grand scheme, I have to judge those events in the context of the wider events, of the context of the initiatives and of the lifelong steadfastness in keeping his focus on certain central things which I think are central to the development process. So I do acknowledge the problems that John raises. I think they were serious, but to me, they still leave me thinking of Nyerere as a remarkable man. And for me, the tragedy is even greater, because I don't think at this point that there was an easy way to make this work, that Nyerere just made some mistakes. First of all, I have no sense that I could ever have had a better sense of how those political forces were aligned. But on the other hand, of course, one has to allow the possibility that mistakes were made, as Nyerere himself acknowledges. So as John says in his paper, in the end, the jury is out on that question.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions. We have 35 minutes. Can you identify yourself, please, when you ask a question?
Just question or comment?
Question or comment? Go ahead. Identify yourself first, please.
My name is Ahmed Muhyiddin. I belong to the generation of those two gentlemen and yourself as well. I'm not here to defend Mwalimu, but I would like to say one thing. I've heard John and I've heard all of us, you and Raman there, met Mwalimu, and you lived in Tanzania. So as I say, I'm not going to defend, but I'm going to explain. I was in Dar es Salaam when Mwalimu died. I was there the whole week. And I saw the reaction of the people. I also happened to be at the farewell. The entire country, and I was surprised to see on television, you see 6 of their turbans crying, the opposition. So that really couldn't be a man that was that cruel. The entire nation was crying. I saw that. I went to the stadium when leaders of the world came there to say farewell to him. So, you know, he couldn't be that cruel or uncaring. Mistakes were made, yes. But they were made within the context of the situation, if I made it with 2 words. Now, what I would like to say is to piggyback on what Fred said. This question of creating a polity. When Tanganyika became independent in 1961, December, the second month, Nyerere resigned. He resigned, and I said in Swahili, and in English. He said, sitaweza kusaidia Tanganyika ikiwa mimi ni waziri wa serikali. itaweza kusaidia Tanganyika ikiwa mimi ni mwenyekiti wa chama. Said I will not be able to help Tanganyika to be if I am a minister of government. But I'll be able to help Tanganyika, the new Tanganyika, if I am a chairman of the party. I'm underlining the point. He resigned, Kawawa became prime minister, and for the next 6 months he toured the country to say now we have a new Tanganyika, we are Tanganyikans. The context, it's a colonial context. There were no people, there were tribes. So we are now Tanganyikans, and our language is Swahili. So he created what Fred was trying, the polity, that we are one people. And you can contrast that with Kenya. In 1963, when Kenya became independent, what Kenyatta did. I'm not going to that because discussing what Tanzania did. Two other things, again to underline what Fred was saying. Nyerere said that the challenge facing a new Tanganyika is not that of change or no change. Africans have been changed. Change is a fact of life. But change is by whom? Changes by circumstances beyond our control, or changes that we can manage. And say that we, Tanganyika at that time, that we have to face the changes. Again, this question of politics, the context. Secondly, he said the choice, now that we are independent, we have an opportunity, I'm talking about Tanzanians, we have an opportunity to create a society based on principles that will avoid any conflicts in future.
Will avoid what?
Conflicts in future. And again, you can see the contrast in the case of Kenya. That what kind of society, what kind of principles? So that we don't sow the seeds of future conflicts. Again, the question of Jamal comes in now. Now, I'm sorry, I'm going to be very personal. I'm going to say two things and I'll shut up. Fred mentioned the question of that was very exciting about Nyerere's ideas. I'll add something more there. Some of the ideas which are now, what is the expression, attributed to other peoples, non-Africans, Nyerere started them much earlier. For example, in 1964 in Tanganyika, in Tanga, he gave a speech which has been explained in terms of the chicken and egg, freedom and development. That these two go together. This is before Amir Hussein. Nyerere talked about the chicken and egg. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot have freedom and development, and you cannot sustain the development of freedom. We can elaborate that. Finally, I say I'm going to be faster. I agree with I agree with Fred again. Ujamaa was not a failure. Ujamaa meant more than economics. As I was mentioning yesterday, Ujamaa was a phenomenon. We can go back to Robert Owen. It was not a failure. There were successes. Now, I'm sorry, I said I'm going to be personal here because Mwalimu was our Mwalimu. I saw him in 1985, the year he retired. This is a picture we took because this is a make of cedar. Mm-hmm. And Mwalimu was looking at the socio-economic conditions. That time, Tanzania was leading. 1985. Longevity, education, adult education, 1985. And you can look at the cedar map of that period.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Ahmed. Questions from the audience?
I just
Yes.
want to address something that I think I heard you saying, but I'm fascinated by it. You're suggesting that the challenges can come together, the political and economic challenges can line up in such a way that at some point there's a black hole and a decision is made in the dark to go forward, and that results in some of the areas which you would suggest we cannot attribute to mistakes.
Let me try and elaborate. There are two things here. The basic problem is that in the world as it is now evolving, as it began to evolve in the 70s, is what I call the congruence between the economic space and the political space has just failed. There is no longer congruence. And if the question is, markets that are not embedded in socially constructed boundaries within which to operate are destructive. They're unstable, they're not efficient, and they're destructive of society and of people. I mean, that's, even the World Bank in its 1989 World Development Report says, deregulated international financial markets have, quote, a tendency towards instability and fraud. So if markets need to be embedded, then they need to be embedded in a polity which has the capacity to do that. And that capacity is, now, once that capacity is removed, then we get, this is the equivalent to the 1920s, then the imbalances between countries, these huge international capital flows, actually are mechanisms that allow huge imbalances to develop because they paper them over for long periods of time. And then you're suddenly confronted with a situation that is simply not manageable. In fact, the US economy today, I would argue, is very close to this situation.
Well, that's what I was thinking of that as I heard you talking about.
And of course for Tanzania, that situation was much more severe.
Well, that's what it sounded
Well,
like.
can I ask one quick question? Why do you think local elites, say in Tanzania or in any other country, become so quickly subservient to this quote necessary situation? Is this because they're primarily feeding their own interests by becoming the intermediaries of that system?
Yes.
Or are they confused?
No, I would say it's I would say it's primarily the first. I mean, it's not, and I'm not exempting myself here. I'm not being holier than thou. People, if you have a huge insurmountable problem, but you see for yourself a good solution, then you will be drawn to that. In China today, you've got elites that want the country to be fully open financially because they understand they will get fabulously wealthy if they do that. But there are others who want to take a broader view, and elites, and I think, I mean, my own understanding is that, you know, when Nyerere was trying to enforce the leadership code, I remember, and of course most people then were hostile. Everybody, there was poisonous stories, and people say, the leadership code, it's all just flim-flam. There's all this stuff going on in Tanzania. And I would say, what do you mean there's all this stuff going in Tanzania? And then one person said to me, did you know that Kigoma Malima's wife keeps chickens and she sells the eggs? This was their example, and they were trying to suggest that was equivalent to the Kenyan Minister of Housing owning the whole of Matari Valley. I mean, to them that was the same thing. Well, they got the same problem. And the elites, it wasn't the bureaucracy that was imposing Nyerere's rule. The bureaucracy was looking to Kenya, dreaming of the day when they could get the real benefits of their job. And just one quick comment. You talked about an incident. I was in a New Africa hotel in 1983. That was with a later ILO mission, and I happened to overhear. There was a Swedish aid representative and a US AID official. And this was at the time there was some food shortages in the States, and AID had come to provide emergency relief. And this AID official, who was really hostile to the regime, said, but I have to admit, he said to this man, I have to admit that in my 25 years of working in this field, I've never been in a situation where so much of the food reached the people it was intended for. And that's just a quick comment about corruption, because that was the other scuttlebutt story that was always told, that, you know, this is just this system that's bleeding to death because these fat, corrupt bureaucrats are sucking the peasants dry. That was not the story. That's not what happened. In fact, the bureaucrats were very lean, and many of them were dreaming of the day when they could be less lean.
Because that's why the issue is not so much about the state versus the private sector. It's about empowerment across the board from people from below. That's why we take the RDA so seriously, or what happened at the Friendship Mill, or what happened with the students. These are real democratic movements. It's not about the state doing it, it's about people doing it. That's what he snuffed out.
But gossip is part of it too.
Well, but
If I
gossip is
could just
huge.
call order Hugh and then Paul.
In one of the clips in the documentary, in Nyerere in the post-power reflective mood, it was a green surrounding. I don't know what the
Talking about the
green was
IMF,
there, but he seemed to suggest that he had that the Wabenzi didn't share. He learned to his regret that the Wabenzi, that his many of his lieutenants did not share his, whether you want to call it altruism or commitment to
Values.
equality, etc. I'm wondering, and it was just sort of a passing comment there, but I'm wondering what people who were more involved with it than I was think that whether he may have, in his whole promotion of and support for Ujamaa and the forced villagization, etc., that he fundamentally misread the human nature of many of his citizens, that he actually believed there was this sort of natural I am my brother and sister's keeper, and that if we all work together and we provide some inputs in a clinic, that these will be mini utopias, and that people will see that and cooperate. I'm wondering whether, even with all his practical and vast experience, that whether he wasn't naive.
So
on
your
the
sense
basic
is that
nature.
human nature is selfish and greedy and self-interested?
Hobbes, yeah.
That's human nature.
Well, no, I'm just
Reason.
one. I'm not supporting Hobbes here. I'm just saying I am one.
Supporting you.
He's dead anyway.
Pretty smart guy.
I'm just wondering whether Nyerere's idealism in that era, in some cases, overwhelmed what might have been the more practical solution.
My view would be that that is very possible. And there's always, in anybody, particularly somebody in your situation, there's going to be a tension between what you hope for and what you believe, and what you think will be possible, that the actual limits of possibility are a matter of contestation. And John is right in many ways, and the way I understand RDA, I mean, the real problem, I talked at great length to Taroka, who was one of the founding members, and he came to a class that I had organized. And the sense I got from him was that the problem was that once this group, and by the way, they weren't peasants, they were urban dwellers who had gone to
So the
establish,
leadership was.
they'd established this, cleared the land from up de novo and created these communities. But that because they know what they wanted schools that taught, but in the ministry they were developing curricula for all the schools. And there was conflict, and there was conflict between them and the extension officers, because they knew what they wanted and they weren't getting that. And it was those conflicts in the end that just led to enough enmity building up in all these various parts of the structure that they insisted that this thing had to close. But this is the dilemma. I mean, if you don't let the market run, then you have to have some structures to coordinate things. And you also need mobilization. And of course, as you said earlier, it's a matter of degree. It's not that I'm saying you're wrong. Of course,
Thank
people.
God.
It's not that people shouldn't have been mobilized, but that mobilization as such isn't the solution. And even when you mobilize, there are some things that you will have to clamp down on, because the thing will run out of control. So you can't say that if anybody ever gets manhandled, that means it's all off the table.
Well, I'd be interested in what some of the people who grew up
Of
in
course,
this world, that rather than spending 2 or 3 years like some of us did, what they felt about it.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I would like to ask one question. You know, in Tanzania today, Nyerere until today has a lot of influence. What are the issues that Tanzanians relate themselves with Nyerere? And what are the issues that they do not relate? I ask myself, is there any Tanzanian who wants Ujamaa village today? No. Is there any Tanzanians who want nationalization? No. Is there any Tanzanian who wants rationing of anything? No. Or queuing for anything? No. What is it that they want? They want, ethical leaders. Leaders who are upright, who are ready to save the people. That power means to get in an office and you don't misuse your office. So what is it that they look to Nyerere today that they do not look for him in other areas? It is because of what we are discussing here. I think Nyerere had a vision, a very good vision for socialism. He wanted us, all of us, to move together. If we are to become rich, then we all become rich together. It is something I think that many of us probably did not internalize, So today, if you ask me, do you want to have Ujamaa villages in Tanzania? The majority would say no. Is there any Ujamaa village that you would say, this is an Ujamaa village that came from Nyerere's time? I think there would be very few. The best probably would be Upper Kitete. If you go to Upper Kitete today, it is not the Ujamaa village that existed in Mwalimu's time. Everybody is a private entrepreneur in Upper Kitete. So there are certain values that Tanzanians still espouse. They look to Nyerere's leadership even after his death. They say, look, particularly when it relates to ethics, to moral standards, to integrity, to upholding these are the most important things.
But I would say that I understand what you're saying, but surely to simply appeal to ethics is not going to get us very far, because the point is, if you allow power structures to be shifted, and that's why Nyerere didn't want to sign those IMF agreements, because he understood if you allow the power structures to change, the ethics will go out the window. They'll become window dressing. We have more courses on ethics now, but there's less ethical behavior than there ever was before.
That's why
and to have, there was an incredible documentary we just watched on Elliot Spitzer and his downfall. And Elliot Spitzer started to actually enforce the law around Wall Street, and he became hated and feared because everybody knew they were all guilty. And there was a beautiful scene on Stephen Colbert's show when he's interviewing Spitzer, and he says, Elliot, what is it like when you walk into one of those hedge fund buildings? Is it like when you walk into a really cheap hotel and turn on the lights and all the cockroaches scuttle to the edges of the room? Ethics doesn't last in a certain kind of world. And the idea that financial liberalization, this is one of the things that the World Bank and the IMF claimed, and sometimes they even claim it now, that doing away with all these government regulations will do away with corruption. Well, financial liberalization opens the door to corruption on a scale that those other people never dreamed about. And that's the world we're in now. So the trouble is, if all people remember is the ethics, then that's a very bad story, because that's not going to solve any problems.
Yeah, but that, of course, I don't disagree with you. I mean, right policies are also important. Right policies to protect the poor people. I mean, not to open the doors for multinationals, where someone was mentioning here. I mean, what do we get from Barricade? Yes, I mean, those are important issues. But certainly, I think there are certain things that Tanzanians probably, under these circumstances, they would not want us to go back to what it used to be.
No, but if there were a national leadership that began to emerge, that started to raise structural questions about what a new economy might look like, that actually serviced human needs in Tanzania, that would give people on the street, you're not going to invent economic policy. It's going to have to be a leadership activity, but it's got to be a leadership activity that's open to pressure from below to define it and shape it. And I think that's what we don't have. We don't have the leaders in Tanzania that are beginning to raise the questions in quite that structurally important way.
Or in Canada.
Or well, let alone Canada.
But in many places of the world it's bubbling up. I mean, that's what the Middle East is all about. The whole
Yes.
of North Africa, after all, is in an uproar. But the problem there is that, when you've got to the square and the leader has been forced to resign, and then you stand there and say, and now what?
Yeah.
And there's no agreement, and because there is no, and that's the real tragedy.
Yeah.
That exactly as you say, that people say, the lesson of Nyerere is we mustn't have nationalization. Well, that's absolutely not the lesson. That's the lesson people have learned, because it's been repeated so many times. And Nyerere himself said it about the Sisal, which means I'm not arguing that nationalization is necessarily good. that would be a crazy position. But the idea that strategic industries in a society could or should have some degree of strategic control, that idea is absolutely validated by history. In Taiwan, this is an interesting note, in Taiwan in the early 1960s, a larger proportion of GDP was produced in state-owned companies than was ever the case in Tanzania or India. And in the popular mind, Tanzania and India are these socialist countries, and Taiwan is this paragon of capitalism. So we need to understand those aren't the right divisions.
When people generally in the world are paralyzed by global capital. So it's a question of what to dare, not what or what not to do. It has to be that too, but it's about beginning to regain a confidence that we can actually dare to do something to challenge a system that does not work for the vast majority of people.
And to think strategically.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's where I think Nyerere is actually very valuable, which is my...
I'll let you jump the queue. Could you give us your name?
No, I mean, again, I'm Sefue, Tanzania's ambassador to the UN. I just want to make a quick comment. And I think we have to put everything that Mwalimu did, especially when we are more critical of what he did or did not do, into the context in which he was operating. I remember the comment about gender, for instance, that the first cabinet had hardly any women. But what was the context? How many women had the kind of education and experience you would expect to be in government? We all know the statistics. How many university graduates were there in 1961? Yeah, the whole country. Yeah, so I think this is something we always have to bear in mind, by the context within which he was making certain decisions or not making certain decisions. The other is the outside influence of the World Bank, the IMF. As Mwalimu always used to say, these very smart young economists, they may be very good economists, but they may not be very good politicians, because I listen to their advice and they are gone, and I have to deal with the consequences of that. And how many problems do we have in Tanzania now that really have their roots in what the IMF or the World Bank told us 10, 20 years ago? I remember vividly, there was a time they were saying Tanzania doesn't need to invest in more power generation, because you have enough hydroelectric capacity, and this is the cheapest source of energy. You don't even have to think of alternative sources of energy. But today, you read the cost of doing business report by the World Bank, they cite energy problems in Tanzania, the same World Bank. So I think this is something we should always keep in mind. The context in which you are deciding, the kind of sometimes very overbearing influence from outside. I think it will help to put everything in
I just can't resist. I know I'm in danger of talking too much, but I have to tell you about this. There's a paper that came across my desk, and anybody who wants to be sent a copy, let me know, and I will send you a copy because it's not easily accessible. It's a paper written by a man called Ramgopal Agarwala, who was a senior economist from the World Bank. He's put in charge by the World Bank of an exercise to review the progress with structural adjustment. It's in 1986. The team eventually issues a report, 1988, it's called From Crisis to Sustainable Development. And the report is completely schizophrenic. It's got some very interesting chapters, some very thoughtful chapters, and some just mindlessly neoliberal chapters. And there's no attempt to reconcile them, they're just there. So I was mystified by this, and I talked about this report. And then in 1994, Agarwala writes a paper about his experience doing this study. And it's really, for all of you, I think it's absolutely wonderful. And it comes to your point about the World Bank. He says, in this study, we determined from the outset we were going to be truly participatory, not the usual token participation where you write the report and you get a couple of people to countersign it at the end. So they wrote position papers, which were the standard World Bank position papers. These are the right policies. They're not going well in Africa. Therefore, it must be that Africans are too corrupt or they're not committed enough, all those standard explanations. And then they put together this really very large team of African policymakers, businessmen, academics, and some international people. And they started really discussing these position papers. And now Argawala writes, after a short time, we were forced, this is his exact phrase, we were forced by the overwhelming weight of opinion and evidence to conclude that these policies were not working in Africa, and they were not going to work in Africa because they were totally inappropriate to the circumstances. And then he says, oh, and now we had a big problem because after all, what else does the World Bank have to say except market, market, market? Yeah. They have nothing else to say. They don't know anything about management or about
culture.
So he said we had this big crisis and we had these brainstorming sessions to decide, well, if not this, then what could be the possible pillars on which one could base development policy in Africa. So they come up with 3 pillars after all this brainstorming. The first pillar is Africa in pursuing its reforms should be guided by the European social market model as opposed to the North American neoliberal market. Well, that's the embedded market that I was talking about. Well, this was pretty hot stuff coming from the World Bank. The second, Africa must build on its own institutions. Can't assume the emergence of new firms. They have to build. This is what the Chinese have done so successfully in contrast to the Russians. And the third, and this is the most incredible, they say in this paper, some people claim that Africa is not integrated enough with the world economy. Well, the truth is, it's probably too integrated with the world economy. And what Africa needs to do is to temper its integration and manage it in such a way that it opens itself up to other economies at similar levels of technological development and builds some strength before it opens itself to other.
So who wrote the other paragraphs?
Well, no, but I mean, it's incredible. And so then at the very end of this paper, he has a really stunning paragraph. He says, of course, the stuff I've said in this paper, we couldn't really say in the report that we wrote because, well, the World Bank, his phrase is, the World Bank is an intellectual ocean liner that only changes direction very slowly. But it isn't even that, because the very next report that the World Bank put out on Africa had no mention of any of these things. And then the final thing is, there's a covering letter. The paper was sent to me by a mutual friend, and the letter is addressed to the mutual friend, and here's Agarwala writing. He says, "Dear Richard, I thought you'd be interested in this paper. Since I saw you last, I've been appointed head of the World Bank office in Beijing, and I love it here. Everything that was so sorely lacking in Africa is in place here." And he mentions 2 things, and this is what triggered all of this, your comments. What are the things that were existing in China that didn't exist in Africa? One, he says here, the policy process is endogenously driven and not dominated by donor dirigism. And the second, which was even more music to my ears as a renegade economist, the second, he said, here in China, economists qua economists are put in their proper place. I rest my case.
No, but not democratic. Is that right?
Yeah.
Any more comments from the Tanzania Brigade at the back here? Paul, then we'll go to you. I haven't forgotten you.
It was kind of a point a long time ago, just thinking about this question of grassroots versus authoritarianism, and just my experience looking at Tanzanian archives early in the independent era, and an ongoing challenge. You have Nyerere, Lusinde, Kawawa, a handful of people, maybe Kambona is exceptional, but a handful of people who are basically honest people. They're not in it for the money. But
They're basically
honest people. That they're not in it for the money. They're in it for, to do their job. And a constant struggle at the TANU branch level and at the TANU Youth League level to deal with petty corruption and just messy finances. And they're trying to they have apparently a British accountant, and he just doesn't have the time to go around to all these branch offices and audit their accounts. And so there's a question about the grassroots, which is the grassroots was where the corruption was coming from the ground up within the party early on. It was not a top-down kind of situation, and I think that changes to some extent the way we have to think about corruption.
Very interesting comment. I'll turn to the panel for wind-up comments, and then we'll end our session.
I think I've already spoken too much. I think I think that World Bank report to me, in a certain sense, to me, validates the fundamentals of Nyerere's thinking. And when I look, and I've worked in China now and in Russia, and the contrast between those two is absolutely remarkable. And I think the challenges are enormous, and they're greater now. And you said much earlier today that the world has changed, and the things that need to be done are harder to do now. In fact, the World Bank, incredibly, they had for many years, they perpetrated this myth that the East Asian NICs were free market economies that had developed so successfully because they'd had the courage and the wisdom to let market forces work. And then the accumulation of evidence just made that story completely unacceptable. So finally, the World Bank agrees, it's a long story, but they write a book which says that it's finally definitively going to settle the question, what are the lessons of these East Asian economies? And in that book it makes grudgingly a number of concessions, saying yes, they were really quite interventionist in many areas. But in the concluding chapter they say, but this does not mean that should be a model for developing countries. Absolutely not. And why not? They say first, because these other countries don't have the preconditions that existed in Korea. Well, so my answer to that is they don't have the preconditions to implement the neoliberal policies, but that's why we give all this technical assistance, so we could help them create the conditions. It's a completely spurious argument. The second point is even more galling, and it comes to the point maybe I'll finish with. The second point is, the bank says, well, the other thing is that we now live in the 1990s, and most of the policies that those countries used so successfully, they're illegal now. We have new international rules and institutions that will impose sanctions on anybody who uses those policies. Well, you can understand if the Kenyan Minister of Industry says this, but for the World Bank to say it is the height of hypocrisy. They're the ones who created those rules. And that is now a huge burden, I believe, for the developing world. And increasingly, by the way, for the industrial world, because we're not free of this. The development has actually not only not happened in most of the world, the very concept is being eroded in much of the developed world. The basic conditions of it, in my view.
Well, I found the discussion very useful. I'm still confused, but I think I'm confused at a higher level. But I just 2 quick points. One, I would reinforce this point about democracy or socialism are about empowerment from below. Now, I'm not naive. I don't think spontaneously people are going to grasp a higher level of consciousness and march en masse to create socialism. Although maybe they have in Tunisia. We don't know what they're going to do. Yeah. But so there are things like that are possible. But I think that's what we're thinking about. And you say there aren't class forces. I don't think class forces emerge spontaneously either. I think people have to be encouraged to think in those terms, that they have interests that as peasants or workers or whatever it be can be expressed through a political movement. And so I think we're getting the wrong end of it when we say things don't exist. That's what leadership is about. Now, the word leadership is very tricky, because obviously leadership can become very vanguardist. Yeah. We have to find a mix, and it's very difficult. It's not straightforward. It's as complicated as any economic question. How do you have a leadership that is leading people, which is still held to account by the very people it's leading, and forced to be leaders of a certain kind? It's a very tricky dialectic, and it more often than not has broken. Either it becomes a sort of spontaneism in a completely unguided sense, or more often it just becomes mere vanguardism. At best, benign vanguardism, at worst, a very different kind of vanguardism. So I think that's the political challenge that accompanies these economic challenges as well. I think this question of, just finally, the question of common interest is very interesting. Several people have said something about, well, the one thing that Nyerere did was to encourage a common interest among people of different ethnic belongings. Now, of course, when I first was looking at Tanzania, we used to say, well, Tanzania has a real advantage because there are so many ethnic groups, and they all speak Swahili, or at least to some degree aspire to speak Swahili, so that there's no problem there. And one thing Tanzania did, which is very interesting, and I think is not unprecedented in Africa, but very unusual, almost at the very start of independence, they banned the chiefly structures, banned them outright. Now in South Africa, they've never done that, for example. I was just in South Africa 2 weeks ago. The fact that these chiefs at the base of the system are a real problem. And that's not just true in South Africa, it's true in the continent generally. Now I really have, nobody that I know has ever really done a careful study of how Tanzania got away with banning the chiefs. So it's kind of, it'd be an interesting PhD research for somebody here to look at. But I think the question is, common interest will come from common interest. And common interest, one of the things that was true of Tanzania in, quote, our day, was that people did get behind a common interest. It seemed that the ujamaa was a common interest. It faded away. I think people will become commonly interested when there's a program that is actually in their interest. And that means a program that really services their need in the mass, which isn't the case now.
At the grass level.
Right, and goes right down to the grassroots and bubbles up from below, even while it's being shaped and led from above. The tension there, the dialectic between those two is important. So I think Tanzania, you know, but any place in Southern Africa still has a long way to go to find that dialectic between leadership that is committed and people being empowered to actually make their own picture.
And Canada too.
Well, in Canada too. I'm a little less. I have a little less hope for Canada.
On that very powerful positive note, I would like to, on behalf of everybody, thank you for a very characteristically stimulating and provocative session.